And then I'd like to introduce again Judy Nichols and Ben Reno-Weber to lead us off.
Try not to fall off the stage, which will be a lot funnier for the people who are here than people who are virtual. If we turn this off, is that going to help? All right, how's that? Good. Hi, I'm Ben Reno-Weber. I am the very recently former director of the Future of Work Initiative, which is a Microsoft-funded nonprofit that partners with Louisville city government and a whole slew of educational and corporate institutions in order to help Louisville advance its participation in the data economy and be ready for the coming AI revolution.
And I'm Judy Nichols. I'm the CEO of Breakpoint Technologies, and we focus very much on helping our customers with data management solutions, helping them look at how data can be used within their organization and what's the best way to help it drive success within their organization.
So what we're hoping to do today is we're going to have a pretty interactive session for those who are virtual. We'll hope you'll be putting some questions and thoughts in the chat. We're going to talk for a little while. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of what the broader components and macro trends around data and artificial intelligence. Judy actually knows things, so she's going to talk about what that means in terms of translating it into concrete things within your organization. And then we're going to open it up for questions and thoughts and discussion because while almost everyone can spell AI, almost no one knows what it means.
Very true. And we really want to encourage you to participate in this. So don't just watch us, don't just count slides, which if you are a slide counter, we have very few slides. So it's not going to be an hour of how many slides can we cram in and how many words can we put on the slide. But we really want you to interact, post questions for those of you that are watching virtually in the chat, those of you that are in the room. We really want you to participate, give us questions, give us feedback, and participate along the way.
All right, here we go. Here's our first slide. I'm just kidding. When I tell people that I work in artificial intelligence, almost everyone is like, woo, that's amazing. But what they're really thinking is, I don't know what you're talking about. And I think it's really important to understand that what is coming is a transformational technology. It is going to touch every aspect of business and society. So one parallel would be the internal combustion engine. Right? Internal combustion engine comes along, and there's some very obvious next order things that happen. Automobiles happen, which is great if you are a maker of automobiles or automobile parts. Very bad if you are a maker of horse-drawn carriages, or you're in some way connected to the horse industry. One of the little-known pieces of why the Great Depression happened is that as automobiles replaced horses, that was 25% of the agricultural output of the United States went to maintaining horses, right? So that had huge implications for farmers. It also had huge implications for the consumer credit. It led to the creation of consumer credit because there was this one asset that not only did people as households want to have, but people were not going to be able to buy it all with cash up front. So that led to that entire industry and the modern advertising industry. Because all of a sudden you couldn't use all sorts of words to describe your product. You had to have something that people could consume as they were puttering along at 40 miles an hour. So part of what we're interested in talking about is what are those second order implications? It's also kind of important to understand what people think and the preconceptions that they have when you start talking about data and AI. Because there's a certain number of people that are like, oh yeah, right, I remember that movie. That's a certain generation, maybe this is what they remember. Somebody just, I see some of the people nodding, some people are like, what is that? It's the new Star Wars sets. If you're a certain kind of dork, you might remember this kind of data. But there's a lot of people who think AI and that's what they think of, or that's what they think of. And all of those things are right. We should be paying attention to each of those narratives, but more importantly, they really are people's internal narratives. And so if we're going to get to change, which we're going to need to if we're going to be successful in this coming data revolution. We need to understand both the aspirations and the fears that people have about AI. So there are basically three things that people can do with big data. And I'm going to use some examples from really interesting Louisville startups. So anyone know what that is? Those are. That's a margarita.
There you
Yes,
go.
excellent. You said that with great confidence. So interestingly, being able to identify that that is a margarita is a very complicated process because margaritas come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and flavors and colors. And if you're a computer, you can't just be like, oh, great, that's a margarita. So training computers to recognize margaritas is actually a really difficult and important thing. Now, why would it matter to be able to recognize a margarita? There's a company in town that works with restaurant chains to identify the most effective parts of their social media efforts. So there's one very easy metric. Hey, how many people saw, clicked, liked? But if part of what or commented on a post, but if part of what they're commenting on is, this was the wateriest margarita I've ever had, that's actually a bad thing. And if what you're trying to do is empower the people who are managing your marketing and social media to be meaningful messages, you need to be able to understand what messages are getting what kind of reactions. And it's much better to be able to do that automatically than hiring an army of interns to go through and do this, which most people just don't do. So margarita recognition is an important component of what you can do with AI. Cluster and analyze things. Right, so this is a map of cell phones on Derby 2 years ago when we had Derby and people with cell phones. And you could see all where they went during the course of the day. Everyone came from their homes, clustered down to either the Downs or a couple of other places, and then went out to Bardstown Road and Frankfurt Avenue. Why would that matter? When you're trying to identify what's important in your organization, being able to pull together clusters of data and say, oh, this is a set of people, either a set of people to whom I am marketing, a set of people who are having this same issue, you can cluster that. And that's not always obvious to humans. Being able to consume that into a data platform and spit it back out, really important. And then based on that, you can use the information that you've gathered to predict outcomes and then potentially intervene ahead of time. One of the biggest predictors of whether or not someone goes back into the ER, which is the most expensive thing that happens to a hospital, is whether or not there is food in their fridge. Oh. So for a hospital for whom a readmission is a $30,000 event, signing someone up for a grocery service for $500, totally worth it. Not something you would know unless you understood, oh, here's the data that surrounds the incident that matters to me. Same thing in terms of defaulting, same things in terms of fraud. I mean, we've all seen the credit card, like, oh, is this really you? Because it's out of pattern. It identifies and predicts, this might not be the right thing. The graph in the middle is a local company that is a virtual stockbroker entirely based on Twitter sentiment. So it ingests the Twitter sentiment about a company, makes stock trades, and by the way, it is destroying the S&P 500 because turns out Twitter sentiment's a pretty good predictor of what a stock price is going to do. So those are the big things you can do with big data. There's a process to this, like what are the outcomes of AI, really data? The first piece is just perception. Oh, I see that thing, and I bring it to, and the second piece is I bring it to someone's attention. Did you see that this person has this debt ratio or made this unusual interaction? Or by the way, is not on path to graduate? Bing. What do you recommend? Well, it turns out they can graduate if they meet these following requirements. Here's a potential suggested schedule for them. There's actually a really interesting startup coming out of New Hampshire that builds a student schedule for them based on their major and their desired class times. I want no classes before 11. I only want 2 classes a week. It builds a suggested schedule for them. Automation. Boring and mundane tasks. If you're getting emails from people with numbers in them that you then transfer into a spreadsheet, you can get rid of that. Prediction, we talked a little bit about prevention. And then finally, there's sort of a broader component of situational awareness, helping people to prioritize what they should be working on right now based on the severity of the predictions or intended outcomes that you're trying to get to. And I will make one interesting point about this area. Louisville has more industries and jobs in fields where AI could be widespread than almost any other place in the country. So that is both a danger. A lot of those tasks could go away, but it's also a real opportunity because if the organizations that we're affiliated with are on the cutting edge of this, then we can be the ones doing the innovating. We can be the ones who are at the front end. There are some fields that are going to be radically changed and might, in fact, largely go away. Medical transcription, paralegal services, some early pieces of customer service. But there's some more, there's real opportunity for us to be able to leverage the data to do interesting things. Personalized service in terms of care, in terms of education, preventative maintenance. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I jump in right
Yeah.
here? If we go back here, there's a lot of things that we're seeing right now in education where they're starting to pull AI in on that personalized educators. And we're starting to see universities that are pulling in this digital tutor or digital education assistant. Maybe some are even calling them a digital TA that works in, and they're using a chat bot to work with a student, and they're reaching out for their help on their course. And this particular assistant sometimes the student doesn't even know that it's not a real person because they're doing such a good job with it. So they reach out and they say, oh, I don't understand this part of my course. I don't understand this part of the curriculum. And they're providing them with assistance and with help. They're answering questions, saving the instructors a lot of time. And the actual professor, the actual TA, they're getting through a lot of the questions, giving them a lot of assistance, improving their grades, helping them stay in the class and not drop out.
Right.
And they're finding a big difference in that type of area. So that's one place that's really helping. Now, of course, there's a difference. As the students work with them and get going, they start to find, well, there's a little bit of emotion difference here. So this person isn't as connected to me, isn't giving me quite the same emotional difference. And that's where you see it, some of the overlay, and where you've got to start to recognize how far can AI take you and where can it help? And then where does the actual professor and TA need to step in so that they can make that still human connection? So we're not getting rid of the people. We're just using AI and data to help you and to enhance what the people are providing. And I think that's the difference that we're looking at here. We're not saying, let's get rid of all people and only have computers manage everything. And education's going to change and computers are going to teach all the classes and we don't need any of our professors anymore. Clearly, that's not what we need. But we need to enhance what they're able to provide. Particularly as we look at the last year where so many classes went online. And in some cases, the student load increased for some professors, where they had significantly larger classes because everybody was online and you didn't have to fit them all into a room. And so if they've got a significantly larger load of students to take care of, they can't personally answer every question that they come up with. And they can't provide the individual needs that they have. And if you're also looking at how do we retain students and how do we keep them involved and keep them staying with us and not dropping out because the coursework is hard or they can't find the answers they need, this helps keep them going. So it's a really good predictor of how to keep somebody connected and keep them going. Another piece that we're seeing in this area is there's that summer, I'm trying to remember exactly what it's called, but that gap between when students apply and get accepted.
Summer melt.
Summer melt, thank you. And when they actually start in the fall, and you lose a large number of students. And so they're using a chatbot again to reach out to the target audience and connect with them and answer their concerns and provide information. And if you know your target demographic, you can really address those concerns. So in some cases, it's questions about finances and how am I going to handle the stress of school? And what is my day going to look like? And I don't know where to go on the first day. And all these challenges that can be answered, and they can put together the data and the information that can be used to answer these questions. And they've reduced that summer melt by over 20%. That's a pretty significant impact.
Yeah. And I think one of the interesting parts of this is as we think about how do we sell these changes in our organization, so we're going to talk about that, really saying to the people whose jobs this have been, hey, we are trying to give you superpowers. What are the parts of your job that you hate? Wouldn't it be neat if we could automate those to let you focus on the parts of your job that really drive impact, that only you can do? What if you didn't have to answer 4,000 questions about where's the syllabus? What if instead you could say, hey, listen, are you doing okay? I noticed that you haven't been participating very much in the conversation, right? That's such a different and empowering thing. What if you weren't chasing people for routine transactional issues? What if instead you were able to spend your time on the areas that are most meaningful to both you and your clients?
Right.
So that's the power, that's the opportunity. And I think it starts really small. So I know you're going to talk about that.
Yeah, and I think it's exactly what you're talking about. It's not removing the human component, it's addressing the human component in places that really matter. So they're not spending it on transactional issues, as you talked about, but they're able to look at where can we best use the human emotional areas to make an impact, and where can we put the data and AI pieces in place to address more of the transactional issues.
Yep. So I think one of the other pieces that's really interesting as we think about the skilling components of this is there's really like a pyramid here, where at the very top, you've got data scientists and they're doing really interesting, building the algorithms, and that's very technical, very skilled work. I was working with a data scientist 2 days ago who's using LiDAR to map internal spaces so that the visually impaired can navigate inside. That's really cool. They're partnering with a U of L researcher who used the same kind of technology to detect landmines underground in Cambodia. Okay, that's neato. That's not the world in which most of us live. The world in which most of us live is 1 or 2 steps down from that. Oh, okay, I have this problem. I would love to be able to address this problem. There's probably something that I can use that's off the shelf. And all I really have to have is the level of technological sophistication to be able to operate Excel, right? That's sort of the layer at which most of the value is going to be created, which I think is not what most people think about. Now, part of the flip of this, and this is where I think there's some really important issues of equity and inclusion, everything is going to require some layer of digital literacy, right? If you are not able to operate your basic technology, iPad, computer, you are not going to be able to function in the economy very shortly, at least in a way that's going to compensate you reasonably. I was on a shop floor a couple months ago, and it's a Louisville company. Siemens was in town to look at the innovations that this company had developed. And we were looking at this guy, in camouflage, and he was working the line, and his supervisor came over with an iPad, and they were trying to diagnose what was going on because something was out of alignment. And the guy in camo actually drilling parts in, like pops over the iPad, pulls up a diagnostic thing. Like that's what the level that we're going to need. And I think that's an important part of what's going to happen going forward. But for us, a lot of what is important is going to be understanding what's possible. We don't have to be able to code in Python. We don't have to be able to understand how things come in and out of the cloud. We don't need to know SOC 2 versus all the other stuff. We need to know that those things exist so that we can get the nerds to be able to do them. We know how to ask, but that doesn't mean that we have to be the ones who actually execute on that. And I say nerd with love.
I think there's also the point here that it's more than just being data literate. This is the point where you have to be data responsible. And that's something that's coming out more and more. As we start to look more at the data and how we're going to use it, this is where you have to start to recognize what type of bias is in your data. How are you using it? And what decisions are you making? So are you using it in ways that will positively impact your organization, or are you using it irresponsibly? And are you recognizing that every set of data has some form of bias within it? And if we have learned nothing over the past year, I think we've learned that there is implicit bias in a lot of things that are going on in our organizations and in our society as a whole. And one of the things that we're seeing again in universities in particular, in academia, they're starting to use AI more and more in looking at how do we recognize the students that want to apply to our organization, and how can we use AI to speed up that process? And they first started looking at, okay, we'll just video all the questions and we'll use AI to evaluate the videos of all the applicants. And then we'll just apply AI onto it, and that'll make sure that we're doing everybody evaluating everybody from the same status, and we'll remove all the bias. Well, what they found was there's still bias in the questions, because each person that was putting in the questions as part of the application process had some bias behind the way that they phrased the questions, the way they asked the questions, and they were neglecting that whole side of it. They were only looking at the students. They weren't looking at the interviewers. So you missed that whole section. And then they also forgot the whole process of AI is a learning process, right? So it's learning from the history of what you've been doing all the way along and improving and continuing and growing. So if you've got inherent bias in your process, it's continuing to learn that bias as it goes along.
Right.
So you're repeating the problem.
And if you want a different outcome, you have to understand that in order to build that different outcome, you're going to need to ingest different data.
Right.
Yeah.
And you've got to pay attention to some of these models and look at things carefully. And so that's why I say you've got to be data literate and responsible as you start to look at these things. And so it takes a little bit, and as we'll go into this further, it's not just, hey, here's a new tool, let's just throw it out there and start getting results. You've got to do some planning and thinking about what you're going to do, what are you trying to achieve, and how are you going to do it? How are you going to do it responsibly? Particularly when we're talking about students and people and what this is, how this is going to affect them. It's not something that you just do and hope for the best.
Right. Yeah. This is you, I think.
Yeah. So that leads us right into this part of the discussion. So many of the times when you start looking at where you are on an analytics journey, it can feel overwhelming to some extent to think about how do we start to move forward. And a lot of us are really, a lot of the organizations that we see are really in that descriptive analytics space on this chart that you see here, where you're working really in the past. You're really good at putting together reports. You probably have tons of business analysts spending weeks putting together reports that show us what we did last week, last month, last year. I'd be curious to see how many of you have some people that spend a lot of time doing that. Anybody in this room have somebody that spends? Yeah, I see a few hands up. It'd be nice to see if there's some people online that are doing that as well. Because that's what we do, right? And you may not even know why you're generating all these reports that somebody puts together and emails out to everybody every week, right? But somebody's always wanted them. That's the way we've always done it. And that's what we're going to continue to do.
Or somebody used to want them.
Yeah.
We don't know who used to be really meaningful.
Yeah.
And now it's not meaningful anymore, but no one has had the either authorization to go back and re-examine those processes, or really the data to say, well, who is using this? Oh, it turns out there's only one person using it. Is there a way for us to just let that person pull it directly?
Or why are they using it?
Or
what are
why
they
are
really
using it?
trying to get to?
Right.
And so that's where you start to move from that hindsight view as you start to evaluate it and say, what is the business reason that we want something? What are we really trying to accomplish from a business perspective? And that's something that as we've worked with customers, we've found is the most important thing. Let's not get so focused on the technology. Let's take a step back and let's think about the business. What are we really trying to accomplish? What is our overall goal? So if we're thinking from a university perspective, perhaps one of our goals is we want to increase enrollment by X%. Okay, that's something we can start to look at our data and find ways that data information can help support that, right? What are the areas that are having the most success? What are our students telling us they want more of? What are we hearing from high schools that support our university that those students are looking for? Those are types of information we can start to get. Or we can look at how do we decrease the dropout rate, right? That might be important. So then we start to look at what are the things that are causing students to drop out and how do we put some factors in place to support that. So one of the projects that I was involved in several years ago, they were looking at, this was in Michigan, they were looking at how do we stay in contact with students and start to recognize when they're falling into a pattern that's going to lead them to drop out, right? So you look at, this is a student that suddenly stops showing up for class, isn't turning in assignments. There's all kinds of factors that you can start to see. And if you can start to address them ahead of time and recognize when there's a pattern, then somebody can intervene and start to change that. But if you're not paying any attention until they drop out, it's too late.
Yep. And if you've got, you know, if they're often, many organizations have someone whose job that is. They are getting some information around this, and they might be able to respond to that. But if they've got 400 or 500 students they're supposed to be paying attention to, or you've got, you know, 6 people trying to do this for several thousand students, giving them some additional supportive tools to be like, hey, let's flag this.
Right.
Lets them really narrow in on that and optimizes those resources.
And if you know what your overall goals are, you can decide where does your budget go to, this
Right.
makes sense to build automation in this place, and this might be a good place to have a chat bot or whatever. The technology starts to come in play to support those business goals. It's easier to figure out your overall strategy and approach. But you've got to start with the business first. And so as we look at this chart here and the growth that you want to do, you start to move from descriptive analytics, which is that total hindsight, to more of a diagnostic approach. That's kind of the next step, right? What's really going on here? What's happening? I do want to know what happened in the past, but I really want to know what's happening right now. What's going on in my organization right now so I can make a diagnosis and I can start to correct it. What happened last year was interesting, but I need to know today what's happening. I need to understand where are we going today? How can I make a slight correction at this moment to keep us moving in the correct direction? Because while it would have been great to make that correction a year ago, I didn't have that opportunity. And it's not really helping me right this moment. And so that's a good place to get to. It's very helpful. But once you get from there, then you start to say, okay, now that I'm able to make these corrections and changes as we're going on, I've got more real-time information. Then you start to look at, now, based on all the information that I have, and I'm learning as I go along, what do I think is going to happen tomorrow? And once I know that, then the decisions I'm making really start to have impact. Because if I can look at what might be happening tomorrow and I have data to support those decisions, then I can make very qualified decisions. And I can start to say, based on the information that I have, the data that I know, and what my predictions are showing, this is the way we should go. And then I'm really driving business success, right? And let's face it, universities don't have traditionally endless amounts of budget that they can just make random decisions and hope that everything goes for the best.
Really?
Yeah, I haven't met many of them. I don't know if you have.
I thought the universities were flush these days. Is that the go?
So I think that types to help. And you go from there. Getting to that predictive analytics is a difficult obstacle to get to. It's not something that you just say, today we're going to move to predictive analytics and we're there. You've got to take the time to build that strategy to know where you're going, what it is that you need to do as an organization, and what the data points are that are going to help you get there, and kind of build this process. And once you've really moved to that level, then you're starting to think prescriptively. And you're really driving your whole organization around data-driven decisions, where you're trying to go, you've got good predictions in place, and you're starting to change your market because you know what's going to happen, and you've got good predictions, and you can start to say, here's how we're going to drive the market now, because we've got the information that we need, and we can start to change things. And wouldn't we all love to be in a place like that?
Yeah.
Right?
One really concrete sort of space in the higher ed space is there's a company locally called Capture Higher Ed.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what they do is really help to target university outreach to the students who are most likely to both attend and be successful at your institution. So, and they make a very clear guarantee, like, listen, we can take your existing marketing budget and get you a higher level of success with that budget. Now, that's really prescriptive. It's saying, okay, these are the ones right here. Now, I think there's some really, to what you were talking about earlier, some really interesting implications to that. Well, is that because, Like if what I'm really trying to do is get the students who have traditionally been successful at my institution, does that reinforce some existing biases in the students who are successful through your institution? But see, I mean, it's not to say that that intervention or that technology or that service is bad. It's just to say, okay, great, I want to do that. And because I want a different outcome, I also need to be thinking about how I'm going to drive an outcome that's not entirely based on historical data and how I'm going to invest in that.
Yeah, I really think that in the university space, you should be leading in this thought process. Research and data is key to universities. That's what you do. I have a daughter right now that, as we speak, is getting ready to present her dissertation on and get approval for her master's thesis. I mean, she's presenting, here's how I'm going to do my research. Here's where I'm getting the data. Here's what I'm doing. That's the process that universities model after, right? It's academia. You love research, you love data, you want to make decisions based on real, accurate information.
And I know you guys think
this works.
I know you guys think that universities are very slow to move and hard to create change. As a former tech entrepreneur who has spent the last couple of years working with Fortune 100 companies, you guys are so fast. I mean, seriously, it is shocking. Top tech companies are so far behind in this. So I think there's some real opportunity to be driving.
Change is hard for everybody. I'd like us, if we could play the video now. We're going to only play the first couple minutes of this video that I think it's a university in London. And I think it gives a little bit of a view of a university that's gone through this process. And they're not all the way through, but it gives a nice picture of kind of their thoughts. And I think you might find some interesting pieces in it. So if you guys could play that video for us, I'd appreciate it. And we'll only go a couple minutes in and then I'll cut it off.
I'm very excited for Matt Gordon from King's College London to be joining me today to talk more about the BI journey at the university. Matt, thank you so much for being here. Could you start by sharing more about King's College and your role?
Hi, Lauren. Thanks very much for inviting me. My name's Matt Gordon. I'm the Associate Director for Data and Analytics at King's College London, and my job and the job of our team, I think, has three major elements. The first one is to deliver analysis and information to the senior management team. The second one is to really enhance the general organizational capacity and capability around data and analytics. And then the third one is responding to requests from across the university and supporting people from across the university with their data and analytics needs. King's College London is one of the UK's top universities. We have very heavily involved with both research and teaching, having over 30,000 students and delivering world-class research across a number of domains, including health and medical research, physical sciences, arts, social sciences. So we are a major and leading university in the UK.
That's perfect. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm very excited to dive deeper into a little bit more about your journey. Could you start by telling us a bit about where King's College was before the implementation of Power BI in Azure?
Yeah, we really began this journey in 2016. And I guess at that point, I would have described our data culture as a sort of hippo culture, that decisions were made on the basis of the highest paid person's opinion, often in very long, convoluted meetings, but essentially data was not really used often in decision making. I would say we had a culture of data silos, where, as one member of staff said, it's quicker to put in a legal freedom of information request to get data out of other departments than just to ask them. And I think as a director of analytics said at one point that really to get data, you needed multiple programming languages to extract it from the systems and a degree in diplomacy to get permission to access that data from whoever owned it and was responsible for it. So a real sort of set of data silos. We also had a lot of data infrastructure issues. So it was quite hard to access the data. When you did get access, you found the data quality was poor. There wasn't really master data across systems, so combining it was difficult and integrating it was difficult. And we had a whole plethora of tools, licenses for all sorts of things like reporting services and Tableau. But the main tool we used for data was Excel, hundreds, thousands, possibly tens of thousands of spreadsheets across the organization.
So how did you go about addressing those challenges? And how did you come to the solution of choosing Power BI?
So I think when we looked at it in 2016, we drew up a maturity curve to sort of looking at where we were then, which, you know, I identified all of the problems that we had. And even at that point, there were some very good examples, but they were very much one-off things where people did a detailed piece of analysis, but it wasn't repeatable and wasn't often very reusable. And so we identified that at the problem, and we sort of outlined a sort of roadmap to take us to where we are now, where analytics has become much more strategic. It's much more pervasive across the organization, and really that's involved a number of steps on our sort of our journey. I think one of the things we've done is we've completely overhauled our approach to the sort of infrastructure.
Thank you. So I hope that, and again, that's just a small piece, and I'm sure we can get the link out if anybody wants to watch the entire 25 minutes of the video, but I think it gives you an idea. Did any of that resonate with people in here? Some of the, especially that hippo culture, you know, that the highest paid person in the room gets to make the decisions.
Some of them might be the hippo.
You know, or that you've got to have a degree in diplomacy in order to get what you need, and the siloed data. I think that resonates with a lot of people. And they're working their way through. They've been working on it 4 years. They're working their way up that chart, but they're being methodical. They're thinking it through. They're looking at what they want to do and how it makes sense. We've got a question coming in, I think. What part of higher education do you think is the best to implement a solution like this? And I think that the answer is, it really does come from business. So from the business side, not necessarily from the technical side. And so they're asking, is it recruiting? Is it finance? Is it whoever? So the answer is yes, all of them, because each area has this important need to do these things. We tend to work a lot with the finance departments because at the end of the day, finance almost always gets the questions of, this is in our mind, figure out how we're going to support this financially. Or even before there's a question asked, finance is often asked to have the answer before anybody really has their question formulated. And so I think finance definitely has a need for this. But if you think about recruiting, that's very important because you need to know what's going on with your students. HR needs to know what's happening among their employees. If you think about people who are working in career consulting, that is important. They've got to know statistics about what's going on among employers in the area and how their students fit those numbers. I can't think of an area that it doesn't fit within.
So, but can I add, just from a change management perspective, you know, my wife was a former McKinsey consultant, and she likes to talk about, you know, change is you're in a canoe going down a river, and oftentimes you can see on one part of the river there's rocks, and another part of the river there's a fast current. And so when you're looking at where you want to prove out as you're trying to go down that journey of digital maturity, I would look carefully across the river and say, listen, where are the fast moving parts of this water that I can latch onto in order to create internal champions for the kinds of things I want to do institution-wide? If that's a single department where you're like, oh, great, I'd like to be able to focus here because you've got an innovative, charismatic leader who's interested in this stuff, great, that's where I would focus. We all know who and where the rocks are in our institutions. And so it's probably not the most effective use of our time and energy to slam our canoe into those rocks. You know they're gonna hate it. You know they're not gonna wanna do this. Let them go for the moment. Unless it is mission critical to take your canoe and slam it through that rock, find the fast moving people and currents in your organization to be like, let's see if we can empower you.
Yeah, And I'm going to also say, let's take it back to the goals of the organization as well. So what was set up at the highest level as these are the critical goals for this year for our academics, right?
I forget what panel
Because-
was it that you were on that was like every good IT project starts with the president reading a magazine article.
I don't think that was me, but
Somebody said, you know,
could
right?
be, yeah. Yeah. But if you don't have any goals set, how can you ever measure your success? Right? And I think every year the universities typically set out, here are our goals of what we want to achieve.
Right.
Right? And if you can't drive it to those goals in some way, why are you doing it?
Yep. I think that's right. And
Yeah.
that is part of the fast moving waters also.
Yeah, and the next question we have even is, what kind of goals should we be focusing on? That's a hard one for me to answer because I don't know the individual stories at each university. But I'd be curious as to what's driving right now. So many of the universities that we are working with, they were hit hard by COVID, and that kind of decimated the budgets. And they're also struggling with students coming back to campus and students trying to figure out what makes sense for them now because their lives were so interrupted last year. And so I would think that there are some goals around that, you know, like how do we survive in a changed financial picture, and how do we get our students back involved in campus life?
Mhm.
So I would think some goals related to that would make sense. I don't know.
Yeah, and I
You
think what's
know-
coming down from the top, you know,
Yeah.
we're working with a company who's got a very aggressive equity goal, which is that they want 40% of their workforce to be BIPOC in the next 3 years. And so part of that is that's the population in which their workforce is coming from. And the fact that they're so underrepresented right now means they're really missing a lot of talent that they're looking for. Well, how are they going to do that? Well, part of that is then understanding what are the barriers that have stopped that from happening historically.
Mhm.
So now they're doing, you know, some of this is for them, it's manufacturing. So some of this for them is around transportation and childcare and other things that are not traditionally part of the silo of analysis that they would be doing. But they actually have a lot of data around that that they could be innovating on. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm going to repeat the question because I'm not sure if people at home can hear that, or if people who are remote can hear that. The question is, when we were mentioning, Ben mentioned earlier, the emergency room and having unrelated data regarding food shortages causing the problems that are driving people to the emergency room. How do you find that unrelated data? Am I capturing that correctly? And I'll give you another example similar to that emergency room that I think may help illustrate it. There was a group that we were working with several years ago. They were working on trying to figure out a similar story of why were people coming to this one particular segment of the community was coming to the emergency room all the time. And they were larger in this particular neighborhood, larger response to the emergency room than any other part of the community. And they couldn't figure out what was going on, And somebody then overlaid weather data on top of the neighborhood data. And they figured out that every time it rained, this part of the neighborhood came in and were in the emergency room. And then they used that to connect with the sewer systems and found that the sewers were overflowing and causing sickness. And sometimes it's a matter of, you've got all this data out here, you've just got to start pulling it in and seeing what patterns emerge. And it wasn't until they started pulling all the data together from all these disparate, no one had ever thought of that, right? You don't think about, well, every time it rains, this is when they come in, and it's a random pattern. Sometimes you've got to just pull these things in. And with the food shortage, I would imagine what they started doing is actually talking to people and finding out what was going on. And someone said, you know, anecdotally, I'm hearing all the time about food shortage. Let's take a look at that.
Yep. Yeah. But I think the question that you're asking is, how do we ask the questions? I think.
Yeah.
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 So I think the first piece is being like, oh, this is, you think about that question, like, this is the problem we're trying to solve. All right. Do we have enough information around that problem? And if not, like, what else can we do to get that information?
Mhm.
So is it, this is a thing that was sort of funny in terms of the summer melt questions you were talking
Mhm.
about. We were working with a local college, and this is many years ago. And the idea of living in a dorm was so foreign to so many of the students coming in, especially if you're first gen. I'm sorry, you want me to share a room with somebody I've never met and then walk down the hallway to a bathroom where, no, this is.
I was gonna say, that was a long time ago.
Yeah, I know. Yes, I have been in the dorms recently, taking cousins around. They're a little different than when I was in school with the communal showers. But still, like, the concept of that is just culturally very different for a lot of students. And so, do I have information around why they're dropping? No, but if I know that they're dropping, I can start being more proactive about gathering that information.
Mhm. But yeah, there's definitely that curve of, do we have the information? How do we get it? Sometimes there's other information that we've got that we just aren't paying attention to.
Right.
Because if we look around, almost always we have piles of information stacked around us that we just don't pay attention to.
Right. And they're often in disparate systems that don't communicate with each other. So I might be able to know, yeah, exactly. Oh, this student here's the grades that are in this student, but that's not necessarily connected to your health system that would say, oh, well, this person is accessing, these kinds of services, or that's the part where you've got the human needs to be involved as the data infrastructure gets shaped.
Right. And I think that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that whole responsible piece. There has to be a human element involved in this. You can't just shove it all off to, we're going to create a system and it's going to manage all of it and the humans can walk away. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Questions, thoughts? Want to open it up for discussion?
Yeah.
So here's a question I would have for people here or at home. What scares you about what's happening? What are you afraid of? Individual privacy.
Mhm.
Yeah. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Mhm.
Right. He was pointing to the thing about the Derby, about people that don't necessarily want their phones to be tracking where they're going, and even in the aggregate. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's part of that data responsibility, right? We need to be very careful about protecting people's privacy and being responsible about what are we tracking and how are we making sure that we're not going too far in what we're doing or how we're managing the protection of people's data.
Yeah.
That's a very important role. We're getting a question in of, I'm not sure if I, in my role, can help start some of this change. Any ideas on how to get leadership on board? And I think that's really an appropriate question because almost all of us have roles and responsibilities that we have to take care of that we can't do every single aspect of in our job. And that's where it's important to look for, if it's something that I can't do, how do I get the right help to manage this?
Yeah.
And there's lots of ways to do that and to get somebody else to come in and help you with some of it.
The magic word in my life is pilot. Can I run a pilot? Because people are like, oh, that's not a massive commitment. You can say, all right, this is what I want to do. This is what I think is going to happen. I need, this limited amount of buy-in and budget, and it proves out the case. I was talking to, is that with the AI conference that we hosted a couple months ago? Massive, they said it out loud. So it's Yum. They were really struggling within finance. How do they start automating some of their antiquated processes? And they started with, I think it was a $20,000 pilot to get a bot to automate this one little piece of reporting. Instead of asking the 20 sites that they were, regional sites that they were working with, can they just try this one thing to pull that one piece of data in? And that eliminated, across the entire organization, 20 hours a week of work. Each person who'd had to do this and email it, and that was it, right? In an organization the size of Yum, that is nothing. But 20 hours from each of those, 1 hour a week from each of those people doing something they hated doing, all of a sudden they were like, wait, what else can we do that with? And so that's what I would say, just trying to think about how do you create those early wins that get you an enthusiast who's not you to talk about the value that you brought to their lives, starts to build the culture of, oh, this is really neat, without the kind of need for a massive infrastructure with 8,000 people who can all veto it because they're grumpy that day.
And I think that the question about any ideas on how to get leadership on board, I always go back to, and I'm repeating myself over and over again, but if you tie it to the goals that the leadership set, and you show how you're supporting their goals, and you're trying to drive change that fits what they need, that helps. So it shows that you're listening, that you're paying attention. It shows that you're trying to achieve their goals. And, again, taking small incremental steps is always the best way to approach it. You can't do, as we showed on that chart, you can't jump from hierarchical living in the past to we can change the market in, 15 days. You've got to take it in small steps that allows your whole organization to change their direction. So taking small steps makes a lot of sense, finding people to help you, and showing that you're supportive of the goals and the direction that the organization wants to move towards. That's a win.
Yeah, and I think that, it's also important to remember how exciting the possibilities here are of really empowering the people that work for and with you. Democratizing data to enable people to drive innovation is such a powerful thing. I mean, so in the healthcare space, where I spend a lot of time working, especially in the aging care space, right? What are the things that are really either the things that drive their costs or the things that drive their revenues? So falls are a huge, huge driver in the aging care space. So one of the things that one of the groups that we work with did was they put together a data platform that all of the floor nurses could access. And what happened was that people started saying, well, what if is this about staffing? Or is this about the age of the patients? Or is this about what's going on when they could see these clusters of falls? Well, it turns out that the difference between one additional nurse's aide on a floor was the difference between 3-point something falls over the course of a quarter. Okay, right? The math on, and then you can immediately drive the math on that. A nurse's aide costs X, a fall costs Y. Yes, there is a moral component to this, which we can talk about separately, but just the pure finances of that work. And that was driven by giving people access to data systems that previously they would either never have had, or they would have had to go through some kind of, I requisition finance to do this analysis, and it gets into things 4 months later.
Yeah.
I think that's exciting. It's important to keep in mind how exciting this could be when you empower people to really be driving much more access and control over their own spaces.
Yeah, I can give you another example similar to that. One of the hospital organizations that we worked with in California several years ago, they were looking at how do they speed up time to service in the emergency room. And if you've ever been to an emergency room, you've probably felt this pain where you get there and it's a long wait and nobody enjoys that, right? And so we worked with them. They had all the data laying around in different silos, but they didn't know how to put it in place in a visible way. So we worked with them to put a big monitor up on the wall that showed in a color-coded way the points of a patient's progress through the emergency room, and whether it lit it up as either green or red, green, yellow, or red. And so at each point. And it was all data that they already had. We didn't have to pull new data. We just had to pull it in from the appropriate sources. And so as it went along, it was either within the time frame that they allowed, or it was getting borderline on too long, or it was red. And as they turned it on to test it, it flashed red in an area, and they were able to find out that there were patients that had been waiting for multiple hours because a bed hadn't been cleaned. And the person in charge of the waiting room or the emergency department was able to call housekeeping and say, you've got to get somebody here immediately, clean this room. They resolved the bottleneck right then, and they started flowing again. That fast during testing, they could see a difference. And it just needed that visual depiction of data that they had that no one had seen before.
Yeah.
And it started changing the whole process.
And that's the thing where I think, like, it's really possible to overthink this. Like, oh, we need to put in place all these automations, and you say bot, and people are like, but really, oftentimes it's just visibility.
Mm-hmm.
So my wife worked in the public sector for many years, and one of the things they did was put one of the real issues for emergency transportation in the city was turnaround times when an ambulance would drop someone off at the ER, right? How long did it take those crews? Well, these are all union crews. There's not a lot of sort of like the traditional metrics that from her corporate brain you could use to incentivize people to do things. So what they ended up doing was just putting a dashboard that was, here's all the crews and all the stations, and here's the turnaround times. Just posted it in every station around the city. Well, all of a sudden you can see that there's, here's the cluster of median, here's the super fast crews, and then here's these people who are not super fast. And with zero investment in anything except those boards, the numbers went from something like 40 minutes on average to 20-something minutes on average, which was the equivalent of putting 5 additional ambulances on the streets. And just that visibility into, look at that. Because mostly that visibility, people don't want to be singled out that way.
Mm-hmm.
Peer pressure is a powerful thing.
Yes, it is.
And culture setting. What's important to us? It's important to us that our patients get through this.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to us that our IT department can respond to questions in X period of time, or that when we order equipment, it shows up, so that when someone starts a new job, they have the things that they need.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm just going to repeat that
Yeah.
for people at home. It's really important how you present that data, both from making it accessible and visually appealing, and also meaningful to the people who need to consume it.
Yeah, we live in a very digital world now, and people are used to seeing beautiful presentations, things online all the time. And so if you just put up kind of a slap happy graph that they can't drill into and they can't touch and they can't do more, it's just like if you look at something online and you can't hit like on it, you're kind of wondering, why the heck is that there if I can't give my, I can't see presence, I can't interact with it, I can't do anything. I have a problem even with looking, using somebody else's computer, and I can't touch it because I'm so used to my touch screen. We're so used to interaction and seeing rich, beautiful media that we've got to pay attention to that.
And never use pie charts.
Yeah.
Never use pie charts.
As you get, even the font that you use, again, my daughter that's presenting right now, if I use the wrong kind of font, even in an email to her, she's like, Mom, what are you doing? It's a different type of thought process that we have now. Everybody's very digital presence thought focused.
I know we're closing in on time. Any other areas that we want to be sure we talk about for people watching from home? See, I was anticipating your 5-minute warning.
Any other thoughts that we've generated or questions from anyone? So
Well, we've answered all, we've solved it.
Yeah, there we
Great.
go.
All right, go forth. We'll be.
Anyone ready to start to implement some changes or think about moving forward with something? No commitments out here.
I will note some just things about the workforce. as you are thinking about how you're going to really drive change across your organization, recognizing people's fears that come from the fact they just don't know. Right? You and I have been doing versions of this presentation now for 18 months, and I will say that what you have shown me in terms of how easy this can be has made it much easier for me to talk about it with people. And I think people just don't know, right? They hear AI and it scares them. They think their jobs are going away, so they're going to resist it, or they just don't know how to start. And I think that becomes really the first, to your really good point of figure out what your organizational priorities are, figure out how you might want to pilot it, but also let's be thinking about how do you bring people along, whether that's lunch and learns or webinars or just demonstrations or sort of hero stories. That's an important part of cultural change.
Yeah, and figure out what works for you. You don't have to do everything all at once. You can find, if your organization needs a small, steady plan to get there, do it that way. It's okay to do things slowly, and it's okay to pick out small pieces. You don't have to do everything all at once, and you need to make sure that the change works well for you. It's better to do it slowly and correctly than to try to do everything all at once and make a mess of it and then say, why did we do this? Nobody likes it. It's much better to plan well and succeed slowly than to just dive in and have a disaster.
Thank you guys so
Thank
much.
you all very much.